What is going on, everybody? See, it says it's still starting. Right. What is going on, everyone? This is Dr. Riley here at Origin Chiropractic. And tonight we are going to talk a little bit about one of the most common things that I see with our young kiddos. As you guys know, Origin Chiropractic is a pediatric and family-based chiropractic office. But one of the most common things that we see with our youngsters, our young children, are ear infections. So we're going to talk just a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about chiropractic and its role in facilitating healing in the human body, and we'll just kind of go through it just step by step. So the first thing that I always like to start with when it comes to ear infections is to distinguish between the two types of ear infections, or at least two of the types of ear infections. One of which being your otitis externa, or your outer ear infection. Right? We often hear this called swimmer's ear. It's when a fluid buildup on the outside of the ear can lead to some sort of infection. But in general, this is not what we see the most in our office, because a lot of times you can figure out what's causing that buildup of fluid because they've either been swimming a lot or they've been in a wet environment a lot. And so it's much more common during the summer months when kids are in the pool and everything else. But what we're going to talk a lot about today are our otitis media, or our middle ear infection. This is the one that we see the most common in our kids. So common, in fact, that I often have to talk with parents because it's considered so normal, right? We consider having multiple ear infections leading to multiple treatments over the course of their young lives, early in those first couple years of life. We consider it to be normal, and that it should be just kind of part of that growing up experience. Now, the main thing that I usually like to talk to people about when it comes to normal is this whole debate of normal versus common, right? Unfortunately, in today's society, it has been really common for our kiddos to suffer with ear infections. Now, I would argue that it is not something that is normal, right? It's something that's common. It happens a lot. And I want to talk about the role that chiropractic can play, and really what parents can do to stay ahead of the game when it comes to their ear infections. Now, when it comes to this otitis media, there are three really common myths, and one of I've kind of already dispelled, which was the idea that ear infections are normal, right? They're not, they're common. Now, the second one is that these infections are a bug issue, right? Or that a bacteria is causing this ear infection, which leads us to think that antibiotics are what we need, and that that's the option going forward. Now, the first thing that will help dispel this is the fact that viruses are just as likely, if not more likely, to cause these ear infections. But the last time that your child had an ear infection, did they do a culture to see if it was bacterial, or did they just prescribe antibiotics and just hit it anyways? Now, why is this an issue? Because antibiotics are an incredible invention that have saved tons of lives throughout its existence. But it's important to realize that antibiotics don't just kill bad bacteria, right? The bad bacteria that are causing an infection or causing some sort of inflammation. Antibiotics kill all bacteria. Now, if you remember from some of our immune talks, or from if you've been in the office and we've talked about it before, your gut, and specifically your gut flora, makes up a very large amount of your body's immune system, somewhere between 70 and 80%. Now, imagine that we're putting our children through these multiple rounds of unnecessary antibiotics, what kind of damage that would wreak on the digestive system. Now, seeing that we're already having this issue with our immune system, which is what we'll get into later when we talk about your body's ability to stop these ear infections, but you're taking another hit as you're hitting it with these multiple rounds of antibiotics. Now, something that I see that's really, really common in the office is kiddos that have been on multiple rounds of antibiotics because the first one either knocked out or seemed to help improve the ear infection, but the second that antibiotic ran out, those ear infections are right back, and then they do it again, and then they do it again. So if the bug is not the problem, that's not the main issue, that's not the reason that we're ending up with these chronic ear infections, then what is? Now, the third myth is that we have these young kiddos that have small eustachian tubes. They're too horizontal, so they don't drain. Now, there's two problems with this. First being, our kiddos are small. They are going to have smaller eustachian tubes, just like they're going to have smaller hearts and smaller other organs. Now, the being lateral or being more horizontal, the tubes themselves, the reason that that doesn't make as much sense is because our kiddos aren't standing in gravity. Not in these young ages, a lot of times. They're not constantly upright. Now, some of them are, especially when we get into our older kids with ear infections, our twos and threes and fours. But what more vertical tubes help with is that drainage, gravity's natural drainage of this fluid out of the ear. So that brings me to really the main issue when it comes to ear infections is that we have this buildup of fluid that is not moving, right? And we know in our office that movement is life. And then without proper movement, you're always going to have stagnation. But you have this fluid that's not moving, and it's creating this perfect, warm, wet environment for not just bacteria, but viruses, right? Because we talked about viral ear infections, viruses to breed and to live and to grow. Now, what we have to talk about from there is why isn't this fluid moving out the way that it should? It's not abnormal for there to be fluid behind the ears. It's abnormal for it to stay and for it to stay steady and stagnant and to get gross and to get infected. And so we have to start talking about this movement. Now, the fluid of our eustachian tubes, it functions more like a pump, right? And it should pump things down and out through the lymphatics at a nice, reasonable rate. Now, the reason that it wouldn't do that is one, going to be because of a muscle that's located up there called the tensor veli palatini muscle. Now, this TVP muscle is responsible for attaching to the eustachian tubes, and during movement, specifically of the jaw and the upper cervical spine, it is going to open and close that eustachian tube and pump that fluid out. Now, when we have dysfunction, when we have what we call subluxations or areas that are fixated in the upper cervical spine specifically, most often, in my experience when working with parents and kiddos, most often starting with the birth process, with a traumatic birth or a forceful birth or a lot of pulling and twisting during that process, that dysfunction leads to this lack of movement and this hypertonicity or this tight TVP muscle. Now, when that muscle tightens up and it pulls on the eustachian tube, it closes it off and it just shuts it. It would be like shutting the valve off on a drain, and it just stagnates and that water sits there and it's going to become infected eventually. I mean, you just have this perfect environment for this growth. So what we need to do is we really need to reestablish this proper function of the upper cervical spine specifically in a way that this child's ears and this muscle can work properly and drain. Now, I want to start talking kind of about some of the common treatments in the series, this cascade that I see with kiddos, especially because a lot of times it never actually corrects the problem. They just hope that they grow out of these issues before the next round. And so it starts, as we talked earlier, with antibiotics. Now we come in, we have an infection, we see it's inflamed. The first thing we do is we dive into an antibiotic. Now, if it's not a bacterial infection, which we know that a good chunk of the time it's not, you are hitting this child with antibiotics for no reason. And what that causes, as we talked earlier, is that destruction of the gut flora and the immune system. Now, since we kind of talked about that, I want to jump into the next step. So you've done a round of antibiotics, you've done 2 rounds of antibiotics, you've seen 3 rounds of antibiotics. I have seen kiddos come in with as many as 10, 12, 13 rounds of antibiotics, 2 sets of tubes. You know, it's just it really gets out of hand sometimes. Now, once those antibiotics have decided, hey, that's not knocking it out. A lot of parents have heard this or are being told this now maybe that their child needs tubes. What we need to do is we need to go in and puncture, usually the eardrum, put a tube in to allow this air to come in that will help that ear drain. Now, when you put this drain in, you've got two real ways that this fluid can go. It can ooze out, which is less common because that would be gross if your kids were just oozing out of their ears all the time. But what's more common is what it does is it allows the pressure to come out of that area so that this fluid can rush out quickly, and it rushes into the lymphatics, down through the neck and into the gut, and is not into the gut, but into the lymphatic system where it can be recycled, destroyed, and taken care of. Now, what is the issue with that? One, you're having a medical procedure with your child. They're having to be put under anesthesia, all that stuff. On top of that, what you have is you have this big fluid rush that goes down your lymphatics. And what is the next stop in that chain? Well, I'll tell you what the next stop is. The next stop in that lymphatic chain are your tonsils. What is another really common procedure done with kids when they're young, right? Tonsillitis. It's inflamed all the time, chronically. We're going to cut them out, and we're just not going to worry about them anymore. Now, what the problem with that is that your tonsils play an incredibly large part in protecting your body from upper respiratory infections, colds, flus, all these things that are really rampant in children when they're young because their immune systems are learning to battle and fight and protect themselves. Now, we have a kid who has had a gut that's destroyed. They've had their tonsils removed. Their ears have been punctured. And I'll tell you, I've had parents that their kids have had multiple rounds of tubes and they're still having these chronic ear infections. They're having inflammation with the tubes in, or the tubes fall out and they're right back where they started. Now, the most important thing to remember about chiropractic care is we don't treat things when it comes to things like ear infections, when it comes into some of the allergy stuff that I've talked about in the past, or any of the other things that I talk in my office. We don't treat these directly. What we do is we allow for the human body to function, and the nervous system, right, that we live our life through, to function optimally. And when that immune system and that body is functioning at its optimal level, those kids typically stay healthier and happier. So we think that it is so important that if you are having any early warning signs that your kids are going to deal with infections, or really if you've had a child that has been birthed at all, that you get them checked by a professional pediatric chiropractor who's focused on making sure that your child is set up to thrive. And so if you are anywhere in the area, we would love to take care of you. Now, a lot of you that are watching, or many of you that may watch this in the future, may say, hey, doc, I don't live in Princeton. I don't live in one of the surrounding areas. I can't get to you. Reach out to me. Absolutely reach out to me, because we have a network of pediatric doctors all over the country in a lot of areas that would love to help your child and your family function optimally and make sure that those kiddos are well taken care of. That's going to be it for me tonight. If you have any questions, be sure to throw it in the comments. I will get back to you personally and answer any of those questions. If you want to get set up with an appointment, give us a call. We'd love to have you, or I'd love to talk with you if you have any questions at all. Have a great night. I can't wait to see you guys soon.